Hello, everybody, and welcome to another thought-provoking conversation hosted by Asian Society France, right here in our new Parisian offices. My name is Serge Dumont, and I'm the chairman of Asian Society France. A month ago, we launched our series on philanthropy with a conversation with David and Susan Rockefeller. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Ruth Shapiro and Dr. Maja Spanu to discuss trends in Asian and French philanthropy. Dr. Ruth Shapiro is the co-founder and chief executive of the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS. CAPS is a research and advisory non-profit organization based in Hong Kong and working throughout Asia. Dr. Shapiro is, in my opinion, one of the most knowledgeable persons on philanthropy in Asia, and is a regular speaker on issues related to private social investment in Asia. She has written several books: Pragmatic Philanthropy, Asian Charity Explained, The Real Problem Solvers, a book about social entrepreneurship in America. She also co-authored a book, Building Energy Efficiency, Why Green Buildings Are Key to Asia's Future. She holds a doctorate from Stanford University and a master's degrees from Harvard University and George Washington University. She completed her undergraduate work at the University of Michigan. Dr. Maja Spanu is a specialist in international affairs. As head of philanthropy and international affairs at the Fondation de France, she directs its research unit and manages multiple European and international projects and partnerships. Before joining the foundation, Maja was a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Cambridge. During her career, she has been involved in a wide range of issues from diversity and inequality in international cooperation to international conflict. Through her previous work with foundations, think tanks, and NGOs, she has had a great level of expertise and experience. She holds a PhD in social and political science from the European University Institute. I will start with Ruth, and I would like, Ruth, for you to give us some color about what CAPS does.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Asian Society.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, whoever is watching online, and thank you for that very nice introduction. So David and Susan Rockefeller covered the United States, and Maya and I will cover the rest of the world. Maybe without Africa. Well, let's make it reasonable. But so the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society is an 8-year-old institution. We are primarily a research organization, but we also convene philanthropists and others to talk about private social investment in Asia. And we carry out some advisory work for foundations and corporate foundations throughout Asia. Our purpose is to increase both the quality and quantity of private social investment in the region. We're based in Hong Kong, but we work across 18 economies, so 16 countries, plus Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I think that many who are watching this know that Asia is a fairly dynamic economic zone, and there's a lot of wealth being created there now. And I think the sense was, what are the so-called Asian ways of doing private social investment? And do they differ at all from some of the more common Western, primarily American ways that are out there as best in class? We don't assume that best practices automatically emanate from the United States. We really want to understand what works on the ground in Asia. What are the motivations for Asian philanthropists and business leaders to do more, to give back more, to engage with their community? We try to look at everything from their perspective. And just to plug our work, please do look at our website at caps.org, and you can see the breadth of our work, which is available for public consumption.
Thank you. I'll ask you the same question, because although the Fondation de France is an institution in France, many of our international viewers probably don't know about it. So what does the Fondation de France do? And what do you do there?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Serge, for having us, for having me as also a representative of Fondation de France, and thank you all for watching, and thank you, Ruth, as well, because you made the contact first, so I'm delighted to be here today. So just a quick word on Fondation de France. Fondation de France is the first philanthropic network in France. It was created in 1969, interestingly enough, by General de Gaulle and André Malraux, who decided actually to, after a trip in the US, came back and realized that actually something was missing in France, right? Some foundations existed. At the time in 69, there were 250 foundations, and yet more could be done. So this was really the sort of initial idea that led to the creation of Fondation de France. Now, Fondation de France has become larger, of course, with decades passing. It's interesting because we are a foundation, we say the toutes les causes of all the issues. Indeed, all our activities really span from social justice, social welfare, to education and research, health research in particular, culture and arts. So we really have a variety of activities, and we also have a specific way of functioning. We are both foundation that distributes funds, right, to specific projects in France, but also elsewhere. And we also host a certain number of foundations within Fondation de France. We're so-called in French Fondation Abritante, an umbrella foundation. So we have 946 specifically this year, sheltered foundations at Fondation de France, again, working on all the different causes and matters. So just to say a word, we function in the way that we support projects specifically, as I was saying, in France very much, but we also have a certain number of projects in Europe and elsewhere, very much in relation to actually emergencies. For instance, now in the context of the Ukrainian war, we've actually collected a certain number of funds and we're distributing them, working with associations, foundations in the neighboring countries to Ukraine. But we also have specific programs in the Maghreb, in the Middle East, and in Africa. Now, in the recent years, we've been expanding towards the US and Asia in particular. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
Thank you.
Excellent. You mentioned that you're giving funds to associations in France or foundations in France. What is the amount you give on a yearly basis?
So we work on, 2021 was 200 million euros. So these are redistributed to around 10,000 actors from civil society, associations, but also universities, because this is something quite important that I think connects what Ruth does and what actually I do specifically. Namely, we support specific research projects too.
In France?
In France and in Europe too. So we work with the University of Geneva, for example. I closely work with them. We're looking into partnerships right now with other universities too, mostly in Europe for the time being, but we've had collaborations in South Africa as well with CAPSI and in Senegal too.
And across all issues?
Well, that's the thing, right? We say that we're the foundation of all the causes, and it's really important to stress that for us, all the issues matter equally. There is no hierarchy. So we try to find the right balance between supporting issues that are important and yet not creating a sort of brand between what matters most, what matters less.
We'll come back to that, the issues, very important topic. Now, would you mind giving some color about philanthropy? I mean, we're talking about philanthropy, but a lot of people do not see the difference, or do not understand the difference between philanthropy and charity. And if you could also tell us about the history and primary purpose of philanthropy in Asia and in Europe. So I'll start with you, Ruth, maybe.
Okay.
Asia first, because you come from afar.
I thought it was just age before beauty.
What's this?
Okay. Well, Asia, of course, is an entire continent, and even there are many more countries than the ones we work in, although we do work in 18 economies. I think there is no question that charity has a long history in Asia. And what that means is people, it's a very human instinct, people helping people, communities helping those within the community who needs help. And interestingly, the only country that really doesn't have a history of that in Asia is Japan, which has less, although it's a very group-minded country, they haven't necessarily helped each other at the community level. Every other Asian economy, though, has a long and deep history of people helping people. Philanthropy is different because philanthropy takes a more systemic approach. So if you have, you're on the street and someone comes up to you and they're begging and you give them money, it's charity. If you want to really try to create an institutional infrastructure to deal with the root causes of why that person is on the street begging, that is philanthropy. And of course, they go hand in hand, and philanthropy without a heart is not very good philanthropy, and charity without a purpose is not very good charity. So they do work hand in hand, but they're not exactly the same.
You mentioned that Japan has no history of philanthropy, but you have a lot of corporate giving. Do you have corporate foundations?
Yeah, Japan has been a leader in CSR and sustainability. That's true. But at an individual level, not so much. And there's really a sense that the state is doing most of the heavy lifting. So when there is philanthropy in Japan, it tends to go toward private museums and private symphonies, of which there are many. But it doesn't so much tackle societal challenges, which they have as well, because the sense is that the government is doing that.
Especially the difficult ones, the ones people don't want to talk about.
Well, mental health, is something that gets a short shrift everywhere in the world, in Japan particularly. So
the situation in Japan seems to be somewhat similar to what we have in France, isn't it?
Well, interesting, right? There are some points in common, I would say, but also with what you were saying earlier between charity being about immediate relief, right, and sort of philanthropy being about a systemic approach to sort of issues that are deep-rooted. I answered the question actually by going back in time and tell you a little bit about the history of charities, that is association, also in the French word, and philanthropy, because I think that the two are very much interconnected. So France is the land of association, of charities, but the history is a little bit older than just the 20th century. So Fénelon was this well-known French thinker and writer, actually was the first to use the term philanthropy, at least in French writings, and that's very interesting, goes back to the 18th century. With the French Revolution, we see a sort of transformation in which there is a strong attempt really at promoting initiatives that are private initiatives. Again, the distinction that Ruth made initially makes a lot of sense there too, because there's something about immediate relief, which is the charity very much related actually to religion. And then there's a more systemic approach to issues that really goes back to the causes, original causes of problems and impact that this has. And this is very much related to sort of philanthropic initiatives and societies. So during the 19th century, there is a strong attempt on the side of private individuals, but also social movements to organize themselves around philanthropic societies, societies to court. The state isn't that keen on that, sort of doesn't really look at it, doesn't control it too much, but by the end of the 19th century, also with the rise of social movements, there's a realization that actually it's important to regulate and control rather than repress and ignore. or the other way around, right? Ignore and then repress. So in France, there's a well-known law, which is the 1901 Law on Charities, that is enacted, and it's the same law that is in place now with some modifications that really regulates the life of charities in France. Foundations only emerged in the legal sphere in 1987 when FUP, Fondation d'Utilité Publique, public utility foundations, are legally recognized. So this doesn't mean that foundations don't exist during the 20th century. They do, but they're not regulated in the same way as associations, as charities are. So since the end of the 1980s, there has really been a transformation in the philanthropic scene. 8 different legal statuses for foundations exist in this country now, and they span quite widely. Charities exist, but just to give you an idea in terms of numbers, there are 1.5 million charities in France, whilst there are 5,000 foundations and endowment funds. So that's quite strikingly different.
And that includes the corporate foundations as well as the individual foundations.
All of them. So the 8 different statuses really vary. We go from foundations of public utility, like Fondation de France, and these are very much regulated. They need a sort of outlay capital that is 1.5 million initially. While we also have corporate foundations that do not need that initial capital, but need to have a certain amount in terms of activities over the years. We have endowment funds, which only require 15,000 euros as an initial capital. So the scene is quite different.
So can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I couldn't help but hear Maja, you said that it's moved, the regulatory environment has moved toward regulation and control, but not empowered. It was not a word that you used, and we just published a report called the Doing Good Index, and it looks at all the economies in which we work to understand, to the extent that primarily the state enables or impedes the giving and receiving of philanthropy and other types of private social investment. And I would say right now in Asia, there's really a struggle because all of a sudden, in relatively recent history, you have much more disposable income in the region than you ever had before. And so states are grappling with, how do we control this? How do we regulate this? What is the role of this private money, these private resources, and the charities, the nonprofit organizations, in terms of what we, the state, want to do? And how do we control or regulate or empower? And the 2 economies that do best on our index are Taiwan and Singapore, because they see philanthropy and the social sector more broadly as their partner, not a set of organizations they necessarily need to control, but ones that they really want to help them essentially deliver social goods to their populace. So that kind of struggle right now is going on throughout the region.
The state has another influence on philanthropy in Asia, and some countries in Asia. Can you talk about that aspect?
Well, one of the very key differences in Asia, and I don't know enough about France, but I can compare it to the United States, is that in the United States, there are very large private foundations that operate separately from the companies where the wealth was created in the first place. In Asia, there are really no such foundations that are independent of the companies. So while
the Rockefeller Foundation,
the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, there aren't those type of entities in Asia. So while you have great wealth, the philanthropy tends to be, not always, but tends to be routed through the company. So if someone is a philanthropist on one hand and a business person on another hand, then they're less inclined to criticize the government's in which their companies, of the countries and the localities in which their companies are operating. They want to work aligned with government, not contradicting government. And that is a very clear trend, regardless of the type of regimes that are in place, whether it's China, India, the Philippines, Korea. Philanthropists tend to want to work with government, which means that although also CAPS is agnostic in terms of the type of projects that we try to understand, health, education, environment. Because people want to work aligned with the state, they tend to be about basic human needs. That's what the state wants to accomplish, and so philanthropy follows suit. And so you really have most philanthropy following the government priorities. And when we talk to government, which we do to the extent possible, we tell them, if you allow philanthropy to flow, it will flow 99% of the time in Asia toward those things that you think are important. So why not allow it to flow and enable it to the extent possible?
What's the role of the state in France from that perspective?
It's very, very interesting. So Ruth, you just were mentioning that philanthropy is aligned and not contradicting the state. So we'd say that France has something, but it's complex. As we know in France, many things are complex. This one in particular is. So at first glance, one would think actually, well, if philanthropy is about private generosity, yes, for the public interest, well, the state wouldn't be that involved. And yet, as you were speaking, I was also thinking about different layers actually in which the state and philanthropy interact. And I'd say that there are, just for the sake of our conversation here, but 4 different layers. First layer has to do with, well, states regulation, very much. So it's the states legally regulating, as you were saying also earlier, right, the different statuses that exist, the fiscal regulations. There has been actually striking transformations happening over the past 10 years in France in terms of fiscal advantages also related to philanthropy and to giving more widely. There's also a very interesting element there. I'm just going to mention, when you remember the fire of Notre Dame, right? So after the fire of Notre Dame, the state actually really invited private generosity. And what is interesting is that Notre Dame is a state-owned building.
They got in trouble for that.
Exactly. So over 1 year, the year of the fire, so it was 2019, more than 30 million euros were collected. 30 millions were actually deduced fiscally. But this was also very much the sort of incitation, right, of the state. So the state has also that role, which is a little bit informal, that plays into those different legal and fiscal regulations. So that's the sort of first layer. The second layer has to do with the presence of the state in the governance of specific foundations. So there's one status in particular, the Foundation of Public Utility, like Fondation de France, which really requires the presence of public authorities within its board. So in our board, we have representatives of the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Youth, Ministry of Economy. There is no legal norm as to how many people should be in the board, but yet, if a foundation is very much attached because of the issues it works on specific issues, then more people from collective authorities or local powers and national authorities will come in. Then the third layer, I would say, really has to do with, at least I'm very interested actually to know how it works in Asia, in widely, but I know for a fact that Fondation de France has been promoting specific issues and topics hand in hand with the states. There's one project in particular we've been working on now for years called Territoire Zéro Chômeur. Territory with 0% of unemployment rate, that's the sort of translation. The idea is really to work in territories that have very high unemployment rates with public authorities to imagine what are the activities that are needed in those areas, and then promote private generosity to support the constitution, the creation, for example, of social businesses that respond to specific needs and that employ actually people who would otherwise be unemployed. And this has been going on hand in hand with the state, and I think it's quite representative of that specific cooperation. And just a final word on the fourth level. And this for me has just to do with sort of healthy social life in France that is maintained by interactions between public powers, so the state and its representatives, civil society, foundations, research, but also arts and culture. So maintaining a sort of healthy conversation and making sure that we're all checking and not working in silos. That's it.
Yeah, that's great. I think that, as I said, the basic level is that the private money works in concert with government, but it often works somewhat as a joint venture. So I want to just mention 4 different mechanisms. One is this term which seems really crazy outside of Asia, which is a gango, which actually means a government-operated, non-governmental organization, which sounds like an oxymoron, but not in a lot of Asian contexts. In fact, you, Serge, sat on the board of a very important gango in China, the China Youth Foundation. And gangos are very much at play in China, but they've become increasingly normal outside of China and even in India. With COVID-19, Prime Minister Modi created a mechanism called PM Cares, which has raised incredible funding and is a gango. The money goes to his fund and then he deploys it. The second type of real government philanthropy would be through sovereign wealth funds. And in Singapore and Malaysia particularly, the sovereign wealth funds play a very important role, and they are the primary in Malaysia and Singapore philanthropic actors. The third are state-owned enterprises, which exist throughout Asia, and they all have CSR. So that's government. And lastly, we noticed a real rise in what we call public-private partnerships for social good. So public-private partnerships in the Asian context have always meant you're building a toll road or a port, and the private sector is going to help government build it in order to receive downstream income from operating that facility or that road or that toll bridge or whatever it is. PPPs for social good are increasing because the relationship between the private capital and government is also kind of becoming closer, and companies are being asked by societies and by governments, and I'm sure this is true in France as well, to do more, to step up more, to look at all their stakeholders and meet the needs of their stakeholders versus shareholders. And that change has resulted in more public-private partnerships for social good. And what that means is a company or a philanthropy, mostly a corporate foundation, is working with a government unit to roll out inventive education programs or deal with disaster relief or deal with village social transformation, community development. So those are proliferating throughout the region, and I certainly can give some examples if you're more. Okay, so the Village Social Transformation Project in India includes 12 companies, and they're the big ones in India: Tata, Reliance, Mahindra, Birla, and Bajaj, and they essentially work with the state of Maharashtra, which is where Mumbai is, and it's the retail capital of India. They've identified 10,000 villages that need social transformation, and they've divvied it up based on their own areas of expertise. So they figured out what social transformation looks like, and Mahindra does agriculture because that's what they're good at. Reliance does communication, and Tata does local community health. So they kind of divvied up the pie and the remit of the organization. That is a good example of a public-private partnership. Unlike the for-profit model of public-private partnership, there's not necessarily an exit strategy here. So companies are essentially signing in for the long run until such time that the villages have been transformed. For example, in Malaysia, there's another example, and this came from Khazanah, which is their sovereign wealth fund, partnered with the Ministry of Education to develop innovative, student-led, student-centric kind of pedagogical schools throughout the country. It was seen as a pilot, and this gets back to one of our earlier conversations about the role of philanthropy. I think that one of the key roles is to be the innovation, be the source of innovation, be the risk capital to try to pilot something new, which they hope government will then pick up and scale in a way that the philanthropy couldn't and probably shouldn't across the country. So there are a number of examples of that, and in these public-private partnerships, very much private sector driving that innovation, bringing the business rigor and the business understanding into the mix of helping communities is integral to the development of these types of programs.
You raised an interesting point, actually, that prompts me to ask you a question on impact investing. What is the relationship that you see, and what is the reaction of philanthropy towards the rise of impact investing?
Well, there's a lot of buzz around impact investing. I can tell you that despite the fact that 50% of the world GDP is now coming from Asia and 60% of the world's population, only 16% of kind of established impact investment funding is deployed in Asia. But that's not really the fair picture, because there's certain descriptions of what is and what isn't impact investing that don't take into account a lot of what's happening on the ground. For example, when a company when an agribusiness company helps the farmers in its supply chain expand their repertoire and get into artisanal food products, organic food products, and helps them to bring up their income, that may not be captured in these international standards of what is then impact investing, but I would say that is impact investing. What is certainly clear is that there seems to be confusion on the part of philanthropists. So they think, oh, impact investing is so much more sustainable. It's a type of company, social enterprise, or type of business that does good and does well. Therefore, I may not have to be philanthropic anymore. And in fact, almost all social enterprises rely on philanthropic capital at the startup stage. So philanthropy is integral to having a successful social enterprise and impact investing ecosystem. It's not either or, it's both. I think that must be true here as well.
Well, France is at a different stage, I would say, in the discussions on impact investing. Actually, the context isn't that open towards impact investing at all. So, well, I would say that's on the one hand, one main reason is really culture. So when you look at boards of foundations and also financial advisors, there isn't very much that culture precisely of impact investing. There is a fear also of what that may represent. So it's very difficult also to convince at the level of governments that it's important actually to sort of think in different ways, in innovative ways, about supporting social good, right? So in terms of initiatives, there isn't that much. There are things happening. but not that much. Fondation de France has created actually an impact investing fund in 2018 that had 100 million euros in it. But it has gone through difficulties for, again, cultural reasons, but also it has tried to push towards social justice matters. And yet, all of the impact investing happening in France has to do with the environment.
Right.
So we managed now to find other partners, and we have doubled the sum in 2022, which is very good. But we're still sort of constantly debating as to what are the issues that need support. Again, we don't want to go into a hierarchy of causes, and yet everything goes back to the environment. And interestingly enough, the foundation in France that is doing really well on impact investing is Fondation Carasso, that works specifically on arts and culture and climate and environment, right? And they have 15% actually of their funds that are used for impact investing.
Would it be helpful just to clarify what we mean by the term impact investing? I don't know.
Yes.
Who's out there?
It's always
because it actually does have rather amorphous lines to it, right? The notion of impact investing is that you're investing with the idea that you're going to get your money back, either just the cost of the money at the amount that you put in, or in most cases, you're making a return. But the investments that you're making have this dual bottom line. They have a social purpose as well as a for-profit purpose that allows you to make a return on your funding. This started a lot with these kind of microfinance institutions which lend money, act as banks, and these were of course started primarily by Mohammed Yunus of Grameen Bank, and he is very much against impact investing because he thinks that when you bring profit into the equation, and it sounds like this is the issue partially in France as well, you muddy the waters. And then a lot of these entities get confused about is their primary purpose to create a return, or is their primary purpose to really bring about a social good. And we did a study on this, and that most organizations who call themselves social enterprises would say, we can do both, it's not a problem. It's just that the governance of these entities needs to be clear. And the expectations of the shareholders also needs to be clear. There's a very large private equity group called TPG that has one of the largest impact investment funds, the RISE funds, and they claim that their returns on those funds are the same or better than their regular funds that are not impact driven. So I would say there's a continuum between no return and market returns, and many of these investment funds, impact investment funds, play somewhere in the middle.
In between, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm getting a few questions, but rather than asking them now, what I'll do is I'm getting a lot of questions actually. So I'll ask you a couple more questions and then we'll turn to the audience.
Okay, great.
For the question. I'm receiving them on my phone, so I do apologize if I'm
He's not just reading the latest
there's no
link to message.
or TikTok.
Yeah.
The question I wanted to ask you both is, have you seen trends emerging recently that are worth noting in terms of the way philanthropy is going?
Yes, well, I identified three that I wanted to talk about, and two I already have. Certainly partnerships. And those primarily are between the private sector actor, be they a corporation or a foundation, and the state. And many times they create built-for-purpose nonprofits to essentially govern and manage the initiative. What you see less of is money going to existing nonprofit organizations, and that has some implications about the evolution of societies in Asia. Second is the interest in impact investing. I would say the interest far exceeds the reality so far, but everyone says they're very interested in it. And at CAPS, we really try to promote investors taking a portfolio approach with philanthropy on one side and very much for-profit investments on the other, with lots of kind of interim types of investments along the way. And the third is the increased focus of sustainability and environment, which for companies, and as I said, a lot of philanthropy goes through companies, becomes an operational imperative, sustainability, but they bring in their CSR and philanthropy very much into helping those companies, not only in terms of their own operations, but reaching out into the communities in which they operate. And that is an increasing trend, especially because there are now 9 stock exchanges in Asia that have ESG regulations, and access to capital increasingly depends on one's environmental and sustainability records. And so companies who want to access capital or are listed are increasingly motivated to think about sustainability, and CSR in effect merges with that. And let me just give you one example. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a giant paper company in India, and they made no distinction between the owner's philanthropy, the CSR of the company, the sustainability efforts of the company, and the R&D and business development efforts of the company. It was all merged. And essentially what that means is that they're planting trees because they're a paper company, but they're also creating livelihoods around maintaining those trees. Some of them are fruit trees, so the livelihoods are not just maintenance, but harvesting the produce. But they're also developing ways to make trees grow faster so that they can cut them down and make them into paper, which accelerates the livelihoods for the farmers. So there's this kind of really nice kind of circularity to what they're doing that helps that creates win-win. And I think that, in my opinion, win-win strategies are very good because they're more sustainable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on this, that your point, trends that are emerging?
Definitely. Actually, it's interesting because there are differences indeed between Asia and France, and we're comparing continent with a country, and we're there, but there are also similarities in what you were saying that really echo the French context. First, I'd say that partnerships is something that has become increasingly present, whether we're talking about actually partnerships among foundations, which weren't happening that much before. Now, for example, in France, we have also a coalition on climate that is very much present also on the public scene, but also European coalitions and partnerships. We work with different partners actually across the continent. We have networks, European networks of philanthropy, Philea in particular, and with them we work on specific issues on social justice, climate, so working in those partnerships, but also again partnerships with other stakeholders. I was mentioning them earlier, but I really see this as becoming increasingly present as foundations working with charities, with grassroots organizations, with public authorities, with researchers and universities, but also with the creative sector, arts and culture. It's very interesting to sort of look at this complex net of interactions and see what this implies. The second level that I think relates to this first one has to do really with, at least in France, greater engagement with systemic approaches. We mentioned them in the historical context, right? Philanthropy really being about a systemic understanding of society. And this is coming back today as we're sort of looking at problems, issues, and trying to tackle them from all those different levels. And those conversations with multiple stakeholders can really bring also that greater understanding, I would say. And finally comes the blurring between different actors of the ESS in French, which is the solidarity economy. Yes. Thank you very much.
ESG in English.
Right. So, which in English stands for
Environment, social, and governance.
Right, that's it. So there's a blurring of the various actors that has to do with CSR emerging in the French scene. We didn't speak so much in detail about that, but it's something quite interesting there. Philanthropy and CSR, especially corporate philanthropy and CSR, and how the sort of lines differentiating them are becoming thinner and thinner, despite some major legal differences, of course. But this is sort of creating also new forms of interaction that I think can be very positive for the way we look at societies and French society more broadly.
I agree. I think the traditional lines between the private sector, the government, and the social sector are blurring, and that's probably helpful. But I think there's a lot of experimentation, and it gets back to impact investing. I think that the use of capital is something that's very much being experimented upon. There's social impact bonds and green finance in ways that is exciting, but not all will succeed.
There's clearly cooperation is key. We cannot aim at resolving any of the global issues, whether it be climate change issues or pandemics, without involving all the actors.
Absolutely. But while that's true and everyone talks about tri-sector collaboration, easier said than done.
Exactly. It always is.
Yeah.
That leads me to my next question. This will be the last question I ask before turning to the audience. Is the question about issues. I mean, what we see, I was looking at the statistics about Chinese philanthropy, and it's interesting that 32% last year went to education, 27% to healthcare, 18% to poverty alleviation, and some issues. I was glad to hear about sustainability being a trend.
So education is by far the #1 destination of philanthropic capital throughout. I mean, those stats were from China, but it's throughout the region.
Yeah.
And it's really part of the kind of, I suppose, cultural DNA of the region that, people believe that education is the route to empowerment and to move up the economic development ladder. Quite out of all of the education, I would say, and this is true in China, but it's true throughout, about half of all the funds go to scholarships. And I think that scholarships are, when someone becomes wealthy, it's the first place that they go, because you really are changing the lives of those people who receive those scholarships. And a lot of Asian philanthropists, be they in private or corporate, like tangible projects. So it's very hard to get funding for a research organization like mine, very intangible. But scholarships, you can see the before and after, what happens to the young people who receive it. It's very powerful. It is true that with ESG, there's a lot more happening through companies around sustainability, and they bring the CSR into that, but it's still under 2%, according to the data that we can have. I think that a lot of that work, just like with impact investing, that the activities of the farmer that I mentioned earlier wouldn't be captured within these statistics. When a company really reforms its own operations to be more sustainable, that wouldn't be captured under philanthropic capital, but it has a positive benefit. So some of the definitions don't quite work, but the work is still bringing about good in the communities. So I think the mix of how just pure philanthropy is being deployed is changing, but education still resonates with many people as the most visible and clear determinant of a person's well-being and then a community's well-being.
And it's also very aligned to Asian values.
Right.
Education is very important. Anything to add before I turn to the audience?
Just perhaps very briefly say that in France, the major trends are first for really social welfare and health, and then second come research and education together.
Oh, well,
So,
that's nice, that research and education are together.
Yeah.
In Asia, they're very much apart.
Well, it depends on how you count the statistics.
Yeah.
But yeah.
All right, let me read the first question from the audience. So, what did you find were the biggest challenges when it comes to educating people, regular people, or next-gen philanthropists on philanthropy?
Okay, well, next gen, there's a lot of what I would say are memes out there. People say next gen cares more about impact and cares more about the environment. Certainly the environment, that's true, and our data backs that up. Impact, it's not as clear. They tend to be more involved because I think the social capital of young people is more intertwined with the kind of projects and work that they do. So they talk about it in their peer group, among their friends, to a greater extent than their parents or grandparents did. It becomes part of your social activities. And we know many next gen who actually, with a group of friends, will go together to look at projects, and that's part of their social kind of norms. I think that the other was not next gen, but
it's the impact, regular people and next-gen philanthropists.
So one of the things that's really happening in Asia that I personally have mixed feelings about is the notion of crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is taking off. And in China, this is particularly true. I mean, Tencent has a day in which they raise literally billions of dollars because it's their charity day, and people just go online and identify projects. And crowdfunding is taking off in India too, and in the Philippines, those countries where people are connected through, online. The challenge about crowdfunding gets back to that challenge between charity and philanthropy. Those projects that pull on your heartstrings will get funded. School lunch programs for needy kids, or health problems for, one person has cancer and many people decide to support that family. So it's a lot of visceral types of projects tend to generate funding through crowdfunding. The institutional, the slower, the structural change has a hard time raising money through crowdfunding. So while crowdfunding allows everyone to get involved with small money, and that's terrific, it tends to focus on the more emotive projects.
It's interesting. So I'm just going to take the question from a different angle to bring something else in the discussion. But we're talking also in France very much, but I think that this is also a wider discussion about philanthropy being detached to some extent from youth, from groups of individuals who may not be as wealthy as philanthropists are. And this is, I think, a strong issue of debate in France in particular. I think in the US actually too, in other parts of Europe. I'm not sure about Asia, actually, I would be interested in knowing. But to me, sort of speaking about philanthropy also to younger publics really means going at the deep level of those shared core values that we have about society. So for instance, there's a project I work with, which is called the School of Philanthropy, called the Philanthropy. And it's a project that goes in primary and mid schools in France to talk about solidarity, about the social good, about the importance actually of a philanthropic culture and understanding of society. So I think that's really going at the basic level of those values that we share, that constitute really the basis, the foundation for a society that is sustainable and healthy. It's actually fundamental. And then I think there's the layer of what it means, how it functions, what it works. And I think at that level of discussion, sometimes we somehow forget it.
Although I would argue that the pandemic has helped facilitate that conversation, right? because you really saw neighbors helping neighbors because they had to.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges for Asia, or just realities, is that many Asian countries were colonized by the West, and so there has been this kind of Western largesse coming into Asia that has is viewed increasingly as neo-colonial. So there's a movement to create local support for local efforts and not rely on aid agencies and international foundations.
I completely agree with you, and I think that really identifying actually those values does not mean imposing them. It doesn't mean that there is an international actor coming and saying, this is what we do. And no, I think it's really important, and actually the work we do in Africa has strong connections to what you're saying because of the French colonial past, exactly. We're actually very careful also in the way we define what are the issues and masses, and sort of try on the contrary to start from the grassroots level to identify those issues. Having said that, there's still that level of sort of shared understanding that needs to be exposed a little bit further.
We're running out of time. We still have 3 minutes to go.
Okay.
You touched upon technology. You talked about Tencent, and there's a question that pertains to technology. How much do you think technology is a tool for philanthropy, both for understanding social issues and finding more efficient ways to address them?
So one of the biggest challenges in Asia is what we call the trust deficit. There is a widespread sense of we can't trust these charities to receive our money because they're not transparent and accountable enough. And technology can play a really important role. Whenever a nonprofit comes to me and says, how can we raise more money? My answer is to have a great website. And on that website, do you tell the world the impact that you're having and where their money is going to go if they fund you? So I think that building trust and building transparency can be very much accelerated by these kind of platforms that allow many organizations to share their information. I also think crowdfunding is a phenomenon, and it is the retail, as per what you said, it allows everyone to kind of get in the game. So I think that, and that's obviously using technology.
It's interesting. So I agree completely, and I would add, however, that technology brings also a layer of potentially social exclusion because not everyone has access. So there is an issue of how to make that access for everyone easier, so that everyone can also have, an easier relation to philanthropic activities too, right? Yes.
I agree. No, I was just going to say the other downside is, and this happens quite often, is if a philanthropist gives money outside of their country, then the netizens, can criticize them because everyone, there's no secrets anymore, right? Because of social media. So if there's a lot of criticism because people all know. Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to prove that the Swiss are not the only ones that are on time, and the French, although I'm not French, can be on time. But we're going to have 1 more minute, so I'll take the liberty to extend by 2 minutes. And I'll ask each of you. We have, unfortunately, plenty of questions that we won't be able to address. So I thank the audience for all your involvement.
Well, why don't you give some of them to me, and I'm happy to answer.
Exactly. What we'll do is we'll pass on the questions to both Ruth and Maja, and you'll get answers. But I'd like to ask each of you one specific question. I'll start with you because I was intrigued when you mentioned that philanthropy in France actually originated during De Gaulle's and Malraux's time and took inspiration from the United States. But there is a debate, I believe, in France right now that philanthropy is too American. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely. It's a very interesting question. So indeed, Malraux and De Gaulle based Fondation de France model on the American model of community foundations, because Fondation de France is a public utility foundation, but also a community foundation, interestingly enough. But this doesn't mean, of course, that the whole of the American reality transpires then in French society. Well, today there's a stark debate indeed, and the American criticism really comes, well, from the perspective of the critics of philanthropy. It takes two different levels. The first level is one of where there is no state. If there is philanthropic action, then there is no state there. There is no welfare state, and this goes against the sort of history of France. And the second level of sort of criticism is those big philanthropists who are deciding on what the social issues are, and therefore just choosing what matters most. Well, answers to both questions are no. Why? Because on the one hand, the French system works very much with a strong welfare state. I won't come back to that. On the level of the fear of the big philanthropies, and again, this is very much of a, stretched argument, but I'd say that actually the average giving, actually, Fondation de France is 360 euros, which is just much smaller than what people think. Exactly. And I think that this just element contests the sort of criticism that is put forward so starkly. We do have a lot of collaborations with American foundations, having said that.
And I have a question for you, and we'll close on that. China has taken the leadership in many industries over the last 10 years or so. Do you expect that we'll see philanthropy take the same path and Chinese philanthropists really become key players in the sector?
Well, prior to zero COVID, I would have said, President Xi came out with this notion of common prosperity. And common prosperity is that we have an increasing Gini coefficient. The disparity between the rich and the poor is increasing all over the world. The responsibility of companies and of wealthy people to take a community and stakeholder approach is important. And common prosperity was a national effort to essentially systematize that. With the pandemic, he's backed away a little bit from the common prosperity agenda, but not entirely. And I think that around the world, and it sounds like this is happening in France too, just why is there so much extraordinary wealth, and what are the ways in which to redistribute or allow that wealth to play a positive role in the continued evolution of our communities and societies is front and center for everyone. President Xi took a position. It scared the stock market, but actually I think that in some ways he was echoing what Bernie Sanders was saying in the American election. We need to deal with some of these disparities. They're deep and they're entrenched and they're not sustainable. So how we're going to do that? China may, in fact, provide some, if not leadership, at least an example that the rest of the world can learn from.
Very inspiring words. We'll conclude on that. Time really flies when you're in good company. It has been an absolute delight to be with you both. I hope, Ruth, you have an excellent stay in Paris.
Of course,
I want to see you more often. I want to take this opportunity to thank our team, Valérie, Raya, Tsuewan, and Nathan, for all the work they do behind the scene. We're very grateful, and we want to thank all of you for attending this event. We've exceeded by 5 minutes. We will keep you informed about our launch activity. As you know, we had a local launch in Paris during the COVID period. People could not travel last November. We have a global launch with trustees coming from around the world, from New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Korea, India, and other places, hopefully Manila as well, and other places. The week of the 10th of October, it will be in Brussels and Paris, and we hope that you'll make time for us and join us. for these celebrations. They will be interesting and very inspiring. So thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.